This is a question from Edward, who asks, what happened to the Labour Party's foreign policy agenda? Is David Lammy too busy with his LBC show? Bit spicy.
Wow, this is a bit of a harsh question from Edward, given that we have seen a bit of a foreign policy blitz from the Labour Party. Keir Starmer's been travelling around. He's visited The Hague to meet Europol. He's visited Justin Trudeau in Canada, Emmanuel Macron in France. And he's also said he would renegotiate the post-Brexit trade deal with the EU, and that the UK needed to wean itself off China.
Yeah, I think sort of what's happened to Labour Party's foreign policy, I think, I don't know, it's not always top of the news, foreign policy anyway. It's not like, it's never sort of, a bulletin leader necessarily, unless it's been, particularly contentious foreign
unless
policy.
It's summer.
Yeah, like unless it's summer, or it's something like Brexit. I guess his team would say, he spent a lot of time trying to prepare for the job, meeting officials in various places across the world. I think it's probably fair to say that when it's come to sort of big issues like China and Ukraine, they've probably kind of kept to that sort of Starmerite, not causing too much division, trying to sort of bring back some measure of kind of quiet government. But I think, there are things that David Lammy in particular has set out. For example, they've led a charge for kind of pushing for some kind of special tribunal to prosecute Putin personally for war crimes. You could say that David Lammy's got extremely good links with the Biden administration, has probably been very useful to the leadership in that sense. And I think that he's probably been the one who's kind of kicked off and started the ball rolling towards some kind of renegotiation of the Brexit deal. He started that trade unlocked speech, I think it was about 3, 4, 5 months ago now, which seemed to be the start of this push for a closer relationship with the EU.
Okay, and have we learnt anything new from all of these visits that Starmer and others have made?
I think we've learnt a little bit about the priorities that an incoming Labour government will have. They know that they need to re-establish our relations with the EU, even if Rishi Sunak's done quite a good job with the Windsor framework of doing so. They also know, I think, that they need to be very close to the Americans. If you look at Keir Starmer's background at the CPS, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, he worked very closely with the Obama administration and the Attorney General there over extradition and cooperation in Africa, etc. So Keir Starmer's always been very close to the Democrats within Washington, D.C. David Lammy is exactly the same. He's spent a lot of time there. He's quite well respected. He knows the think tankers quite well and the sort of the foreign policy establishment there. And then on the Brexit question and the Europe question, I think that was really interesting, because I don't think they had the perfect week. They sort of started off saying that they did want to pursue a closer relationship through this renegotiation of the TCA in 25, I don't think. And then later on, we learned that the EU didn't really see it as a renegotiation. They basically saw it as a check-in about how the implementation's going. So how much they can actually change that deal, I think there's a big question mark over. But I think Rachel's right. The broad point about UK foreign policy, and we've seen it over Ukraine, we also see it over China, is that there's broad consensus between the two parties, so it doesn't dominate the Westminster conversation.
Not in the way that it did when Jeremy Corbyn had very different foreign policy lines than the government did.
Indeed, yeah. And I think sort of they're helped with this because, Donald Trump, if he was re-elected, would not be popular, and I think a lot of people are quite comfortable settling into an international consensus that is not necessarily particularly welcoming for someone like Trump. I think there's a couple of other things to mention in terms of like Labour policy. David Lammy's made a couple of speeches on kleptocracy in particular, and has tried to drive an anti-corruption agenda. Similarly, on climate change, he's pushing for like a fourth pillar of the UN to include some kind of like green commitment for countries across the world. But again, those are things that never exactly lead the bulletins. So they're very easy to be missed by people, I think.
Perhaps going back to our question, the thing that people see more of from David Lammy are those, quite provocative clips from his LBC show. So perhaps it does look a bit like his priority is doing his sort of media stuff, which he's very good at, rather than the foreign policy stuff, which often doesn't top the agenda.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's exactly as you say. It is kind of, it's the talking points of the day, LBC, isn't it? It's not like people are going to ring in every day and discuss China and Ukraine all the time, even though those issues might be important to them every now and again. They're more likely to call up and want to talk about universal credit or immigration or things that aren't necessarily foreign policy based.
I wonder when he'll stop doing the show? Do you think he'll stop during the campaign or when they get in? Obviously, he can't be foreign secretary and also do the show, so he'll have to stop at some point, right?
Yeah.
And I think the closer they get to the election, the more pressure there will be to do so. Just on the Trump point, I think this is the key question for Labour's foreign policy. We might have the two elections at the same time next year. Obviously, the US election is in November, and there are some suggestions that the UK election will be in the autumn. How a Labour government, if they do get in, manages a Trump government, if he does get in, is a massive question. Let's imagine, for instance, that Trump just pulls 40 billion out of aid to Ukraine. Does the UK then step up and have to give Ukraine another 10 billion to try and fill the gap? I mean, there's huge questions over how Trump will treat NATO and what Keir Starmer will do. So I think that's the question that should be animating them at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and a really interesting point, actually, because you would have seen Biden's speech at the UN this week where he was kind of trying to rally various different countries into kind of moving away from populism, and there was a message for back home as well as potential allies abroad, basically. So yeah, it'd be an interesting question for Labour the next election. How would they handle Trump?
And it would be the same question, I think, for an incoming Conservative government as well, because we do have this like you say, a bipartisan political consensus on how the UK should be responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But you've seen that sort of personal animosity between Donald Trump and UK Labour politicians play out with his clashes with Sadiq Khan, for example. Keir Starmer's a very different politician from Sadiq Khan, but you can see that there might be a little bit more of a toxic relationship there than perhaps with Conservative counterparts.
I think so. And Keir Starmer, I think it was on a Politico podcast at the weekend, he made this comment which was is seemingly innocuous, but he basically said that, or admitted that Donald Trump was not his desirable candidate for president, which it doesn't sound like a massive statement, but I think we know how thin-skinned Donald Trump is. We know that he cares what the mayor of a city in the UK says about him, and he will tweet about it and will act upon it. So I think that was quite dangerous. I wrote that in a morning call this week, and some of the comments back were really interesting. What someone just said, well, Trump's an exception. I mean, he's already such a threat to NATO and to the Western security establishment that it's okay for Starmer to make these comments. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. I just think it is a risk. There's not much benefit in distancing yourself from a future US president at the moment. I mean, we can see how the election goes. I can't imagine Joe Biden is asking Keir Starmer every day to endorse him. And we've also not seen Keir Starmer go to the White House yet.
Yeah.
Remember, that's something that Tony Blair did back in 96, I think it was, when he went to the White House and saw Bill Clinton at that famous press conference together. So I don't know whether that'll be something that Keir Starmer wants to do, but it's definitely not happened yet.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.